please turn in your Bibles to the book of 2 Samuel chapter 6 and place a marker in Psalms chapter 34. 2 Samuel chapter 6 and Psalms chapter 34. Today when I read, I'm going to be reading from the New International Version as we dive back into our series called The Heart of a King. We began this series back in April when we read a passage from the book of 1 Samuel in which God himself refers to David as a man after his own heart. I mentioned in previous weeks that one of my deepest desires as it pertains to my relationship with God is that someday the Lord might, even for just a moment, view me as a man after his own heart. I can't imagine a better brag than that, can you? That's the reason that we're spending several weeks examining the heart and the character of David to see if we can find out what made him so special. Because if we can find out what made David's heart so special, maybe we can try to gain some of those characteristics. And in doing so, we too can please the Lord. Thus far, we've talked about how David had a heart of courage and how he had a heart of patience. Today, we're going to look at another aspect of David's heart. It's one that we see all throughout David's life, but probably never so in your face as we see it in a story from 2 Samuel chapter 6. Now, the story begins in verse 12 of 2 Samuel 6. This is what verse 12 says. It says, "Now King David was told, 'The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has because of the ark of God.' So David went to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing." Now, before we read the rest of our text, I think it's important that we stop and I explain why this story is such a big deal. Why is this story of David going to get the ark and bringing it home such a big deal? The ark of God, also referred to as the Ark of the Covenant, was a wooden box. It was a box made out of acacia wood that the Lord had directed Moses to have made all the way back in Exodus chapter 25. This box was about 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2 feet tall. It was made of acacia wood, and it was covered inside and out with pure gold. It had on it 4 rings, one on each corner, that were used to carry the ark on wooden poles that were also covered in pure gold. Now, inside this box were the tablets on which the 10 Commandments had been written. And according to Hebrews chapter 9, it also had a jar of manna and Aaron's staff. In the book of Exodus, the Ark of the Covenant had been kept in the centralmost part of the tabernacle, in an area that was referred to as the Holy of Holies, an area that only the chief priest could enter. The Ark of the Covenant represented God's presence here on earth. In fact, it served as his throne. The Ark had played a crucial role in Israel's history. You may recall that when the Israelites entered into the promised land that God had given them, they had to cross the Jordan River. And the Jordan River was at flood stage, and there was no way for them to cross. Well, they were led by the Levites carrying the ark of God. And as soon as those priests' feet touched the water, the Bible says that the river stopped flowing. And the nation of Israel was able to cross the river on dry ground. A short time later, the ark was carried around the walled city of Jericho for 7 days before the Lord tore down those walls and delivered that city into the hands of the Israelites. Now, unfortunately, the ark was later captured by the Philistines when they defeated the Israelites. And the ark ended up moving from place to place to place before eventually being dropped off at the house of a man named Abinadab. It stayed with Abinadab for 20 years while Saul was king. But when David became king, he knew that the ark needed to come home. So he gathered 30,000 men to go get the ark and to bring it home. Unfortunately, the way that he went about it was all wrong. You see, the Lord had given very specific instructions for how the ark was to be moved. It was to be carried only by the Levites on the poles that were in the rings that were built into the ark. Well, the first time that David went to get the ark, they didn't do that. He didn't know that that was an instruction given by God. He didn't research it. So they just took the ark and they put it on a cart. At one point, one of the oxen who was pulling the cart began to stumble, and a man named Uzzah reached up to steady the ark with his hand, and as soon as he touched it, he died. Well, this scared David. He said, man, if this thing's killing people, I don't want to bring it back with me. If the Lord's angry with us for some reason, I don't want to continue this course of action. So instead of bringing it home to Jerusalem, they left the ark at the home of Obed-Edom. And that brings us to our text. The ark had been at the home of Obed-Edom for 3 months, the Bible says. And it says that Obed-Edom and all of his household had been blessed during that time because of the presence of God. Well, upon hearing this, David decided that the Lord must not have been angry any longer, and that it was okay to go get the ark and to bring it home. But this time, he did it right. This time he researched and he found out what the Lord had said. So this time, instead of putting it on a cart, he took the Levites and he took the poles and they carried the ark home. I want us to look again at our text from 2 Samuel chapter 6, and we're going to read verses 12 through 15 that talks about them bringing the ark home. It says, now King David was told, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has, because of the ark of God. So David went to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. It says, wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets. Now, church, I know that with all the background I gave you, it took us a minute to get here, but I believe that this story shows us a key aspect of David's heart. I believe it illustrates it so well that David had a heart of worship. See, it's obvious in our text that David knew where the ark belonged. He knew that it needed to come home. And while he probably did get the cart before the horse, he probably got things out of order. He should have done a little more research first. And while he did get really scared when Uzzah died and kind of like backed up a minute and said, okay, hold on, he still knew what was right. He still knew that the ark needed to come home. He still knew that it was important to have the presence of God right in the center of everything Israel did. And the mere thought of this actually happening. The mere thought of the fact that they were bringing the presence of God back into Israel, back into Jerusalem where it belonged. It made David so excited that he couldn't help but worship. It says that he took off his kingly garments and he put on an ephod and he leaped and danced before the Lord, celebrating, praising, worshiping God. Church, can you imagine what our lives might look like if we felt that way about the presence of God? Can you imagine what our relationship with God might look like if we woke up on Sunday mornings with a heart that is so overwhelmed by the fact that we get to come together and experience God's presence? Church, today I want to challenge you to have a heart of worship. I want to challenge you to have a heart that is so overwhelmed by the thought of experiencing God's presence that you can't help but worship Him. Does that sound to anyone like something you want? Does anyone here other than me want to have a heart of worship? Want to have a heart that is excited by the mere thought of the presence of God? Well, if that's you today, I want to share with you 3 things that I noticed about David's worship that just might help you and I get there. The first thing that I noticed when reading this is that David's worship was public. In 2 Samuel 6:14 and 15, we read that David danced before the Lord with all his might. Church, I have a question for you. Have you ever danced with all your might? Listen, I don't even mean before the Lord. I just mean in general. Have you ever danced before the Lord with all your might? I'm talking about on the pool deck on the cruise ship. You know, I'm talking about at your best friend's wedding. I'm talking about at a Taylor Swift concert. Have you ever danced with all your might? If you have, let me tell you something. You're going to realize that you can't do that without people noticing. Christina and I love to go on cruises, and I'm going to admit it right here on camera and everything. When we do, we like to dance. And when I get on the dance floor, you better believe people notice. When you dance with all your might, people are going to notice. Listen, church, David's worship was public. David's worship was noticeable. It wasn't something he was hiding. It was out in the open. He was out in the open celebrating God. His worship was a public declaration of his love and his reverence for the Lord. Now, why is that important? It's important because it shows us that worship isn't just a private affair. Worship is not only something that we're supposed to do in our closet with the door closed. Worship isn't only something that we're supposed to do at home in our bedroom or in the living room or at the kitchen table. Worship isn't only something we're supposed to do when we're in the car by ourselves. While personal and private worship is crucial, there is also great power in public worship. When we gather together as a church and we worship God openly, not only are we strengthening our own faith, but we are also serving as a witness of God's goodness to those around us. Just this morning, Patsy was telling me about someone that we had prayed for. I've told you about him in the past, who's been healed. And she said, the reason I tell you is it's important for you to know. And I said, yeah, it's important. The Bible tells us we're supposed to share those things. We're supposed to celebrate together what God does, to sing God's praises. David didn't care who was watching. he was going to worship God. In fact, if we were to have continued reading, we would have found that in verse 16, David's wife Michal was watching from a window in the palace when the procession reached the city. And when she saw David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she didn't like it. She didn't think it was very kingly of him. She didn't think it was very dignified. So when he got home, she told him how she felt. But in David's response to her, we see the second thing that I noticed about David's worship. In verse number 20, Michal tells David what she thinks. And in verse 21, he replies, "It was before the Lord, who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord." The second thing I noticed in this story is that David's worship was focused. It was focused. As I've already mentioned, David's worship was definitely public, but that doesn't mean it was done for the benefit of those around him. David wasn't trying to get anyone's attention. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. David's worship was focused on God. There was one person worthy of David's worship, and there was one person to whom he was going to give it. When David danced before the Lord with all his might, he wasn't concerned with what others thought about him because he wasn't worshiping for them. His focus was entirely on God. He tells Michal, "It was before the Lord that I danced. It was before the Lord that I did this thing. It wasn't for you. It wasn't for your father. It wasn't for the slave girls that you're so worried about having seen me look undignified. I was dancing for my God." He goes on to say, essentially, let me make one thing clear. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will celebrate before the Lord. He says, I'll probably even get more undignified. He said, just you wait. You ain't seen nothing yet. I love how David's focus was on God. It wasn't on his own dignity. It wasn't on his own reputation. He wasn't worried whether or not he looked kingly. His only concern was expressing his love and his appreciation for God. His worship was an expression of his heart's devotion to God, unconcerned with the opinion of others. Listen, church, I really hope you can get a hold of this. When we come together in a worship service, our focus should only be on one thing. It should only be on God. It shouldn't be on how pretty the music is, although Christina plays beautifully. It shouldn't be on how much we love the song that's playing. It shouldn't be on how loud the speakers are or how quiet. It shouldn't be on how warm or cool the room is. It shouldn't be on whether or not the person next to us might hear us sing. And it shouldn't be on how cute the new boy is. Our focus should be on God and God alone. True worship involves focusing our hearts and minds on God and on giving Him the glory that He deserves, regardless of what others might see or think. Church, can I tell you what some of the most impactful times of worship are in my own life? They're when I get lost in worship. There are times here on Sunday mornings when I'll start worshiping God, and His love and His power and His presence will just overwhelm me, and tears will be streaming down my face, and I'll have my eyes closed and my hands lifted, and I know that Christina's got to be just like, is he ever going to come up? Like, I'm done with my part here. It's your turn. But I'm lost. I'll never forget one night we were at youth camp. Christina and I were on the worship team that year, and I was the drummer. Now, if you've never been to an Assemblies of God youth camp in the state of Arkansas, you're truly missing out. They are amazing. You get these students down to Hot Springs for a week, away from their computers and their phones and their Xboxes and their friends and their parents. And they really learn how to seek God. Sometimes the altar service, I'm talking about, we've already done worship, we've already preached, we've already prayed for people, and then we're just in the altar for an hour or more with students just seeking God, just wanting more of Him, worshiping Him, praising Him, loving Him. One night we were there, and the Spirit really fell, and we were just worshiping God, not caring what anyone thought. And I was playing the drums, but I was also worshiping. And to be honest, as far as the drumming goes, I was pretty much on autopilot. I mean, let me tell you, you play enough boom chicks, you can do, I can play a boom chick and make an omelet at the same time. I can play a boom chick and have coffee. I can play a boom chick and make a spreadsheet. I mean, it's just like, it's really easy, right? I'll fly away, I'll fly away. That's not how that song goes. How's that song go? Let's do a different one. Look what the Lord has done. Look what the Lord has done. Then you just change it. He set me free, yes, He set me free, and He broke the... I mean, it's the same thing over, and you can do that for hours on end. And so I'm just sitting there, and I'm playing, and I'm worshiping God, and I'm not really paying attention to anything except God. And then somewhere in like the back of my mind, like somewhere where in my subconscious, I hear something that sounds terribly out of place. And it's a snare drum. And the reason that it sounds terribly out of place is because it is way off beat. And then about a second later, I hear another one. And in that instant, it was like I was sucked back into reality. And I opened my eyes, and I looked up, and the worship pastor was playing the keyboard and looking at me with a look like, what in the world are you doing? Because I had gotten so caught up in worshiping God, I just lost the beat and I just hit a snare. Whole worship team was like looking like, is he okay? Did he just have a stroke? Just like David, my worship was focused on God. Now, to be clear, I probably should have been doing a little less worshiping and a little more paying attention to what I was supposed to be doing so that other people could worship in the moment. But I was focused. I love David's response to Michal because it really says something about who David was. Yes, he was definitely expressive in his worship. But it wasn't for show. It wasn't for anyone. But he also didn't hide it from anyone. How did he do that? How did David live like that? How did he participate in public worship without regard to what people thought? Because that's the struggle, right? How do you get over what people may think? Let me tell you how. The third thing that I noticed about David's worship was that it was authentic. David's worship was real. David's worship was genuine and heartfelt. It came from a place deep down inside of him where he had seen God deliver him time and time and time again. He saw God deliver him from the lion. He saw God deliver him from the bear. He saw God deliver him from the giant that had scared the entire Israelite army. David had seen God be faithful time and time and time again. His worship wasn't a show for the people who were around him. It was an outpouring of his feelings for God. Authentic worship doesn't care who's watching or what they may think, because it's not about them. The authenticity in David's worship is what made his worship so powerful. And church, in our worship, it's crucial that we too are authentic, that we are genuine, that we are real, that we're not just reading words off of a screen that somebody else wrote, but that we are connecting with those words and what they mean to us. That we're remembering all the times that God was faithful to us. That we're remembering how many times he's healed us, how many times he's delivered us, how many times he's forgiven us, how many times he's provided for us. Real worship, like David's worship, doesn't come from the mind, it comes from the heart. God isn't looking for a performance. He's looking for hearts that are devoted to him. Authentic worship comes from a place of sincerity, where we come before God just like we are, and we offer him our true selves. The reason that David was able to worship publicly without concern for what others might see or might think is because his worship came from inside of him. It came from his heart. It came from his relationship with the one true God. It was part of who he was. And we see it exhibited all throughout David's life. David had a heart of worship. That's why David wrote a significant portion of the book of Psalms. Because David had a heart of worship and it needed an outlet. So he wrote psalm after psalm after psalm of worship and praise to his God. If you would, I want you to turn to Psalms chapter 34. This is just one of the many, many, many psalms that David wrote. And in verses 1 and 2, David begins this psalm with a statement that is so powerful. It's a statement that if Michal had known it, she never would have questioned David's worship when he was bringing the ark home. In verses 1 and 2 of Psalms 34, this is what David says: I will extol the Lord at all times. His praise will always be on my lips. I will glory in the Lord. Let the afflicted hear and rejoice. He said his praise will always be on my lips. David's worship was authentic. It wasn't just there when there was a crowd. It wasn't just there when David was alone. It wasn't just there when he liked the song that was being played or when the drums started to build and make him feel emotional. It wasn't even confined to a specific time or place. David resolved to praise the Lord at all times. His worship was constant. It was an integral part of his life. Because David had a heart of worship. I'm going to ask everyone in the room to bow your head and close your eyes. David's worship was public, but it wasn't about the people around him, because David's worship was focused on God. And the way he was able to maintain that balance is because David's worship was authentic. It was real. It was genuine. We too need to strive to have a heart of worship. Lord, I love you. Lord, I pray that you'll forgive me for the times that I worship you half-heartedly. I'm so easily distracted, focused on so many things. But Lord, I truly do love you. I truly do long to worship you. Lord, I pray that you will teach us how to have hearts of worship, that you will give us a desire and a fervor to worship you and you alone, not concerned with what anyone may see or think, but truly being focused on you.